This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, Reagan OMB director David Stockman argues in his new book, Trump's War on Capitalism, that the economic policies of the Trump administration were a failure. He's interviewed by New York Times Federal Reserve and economy reporter Jeanna Smialek.
This is Rachel from C-SPAN's podcast team. If you read nonfiction books and thought-provoking discussions with authors spark your interest, you'll find the Book TV newsletter a valuable learning resource for staying informed.
Hi, John here, one of the producers at Book TV. Think of the Book TV newsletter as your weekly literary update, your source for advance notice of program highlights, featured book festivals, and in-depth profiles of nonfiction authors.
Explore the Book TV newsletter to organize your viewing and ensure you never miss a significant literary event.
Be a Book TV insider with our weekly newsletter, because Book TV is television for serious readers like you.
Subscribe today at cspan.org/connect. That's cspan.org/connect.
David, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about your book, Trump's War on Capitalism. I usually, when I do an interview about a book, I always like to start by asking the author, what motivated you to write this, and what are you trying to sort of convey at a high level? What's your big point with this book?
My biggest point is that Donald Trump is no way, shape, or form an economic conservative. He's barely a Republican when it comes to the basics, of free markets, free trade, minimal government out of Washington. He has a record that has been totally exaggerated in terms of what actually happened during 2017 to 2020. And he committed the unforgivable sin of ordering effectively a shutdown of the economy in March 2020 without any regard for all the issues that are important to conservatives: personal liberty, private property, markets. All of this was swept aside in a panic over COVID because he was listening to Dr. Fauci and Birx and all the wrong people. This is unforgivable because it's had lasting effects, and we'll go into some of it in terms of the massive stimulus spending that occurred, the crazy money printing that was generated by the Fed after March 2020. All of this paved the way for the inflationary surge that we've been struggling with, and set the economy back, years and years, and created a fiscal mess that is truly dangerous as we move into the future. So I wanted to, remind Republicans that Donald Trump may have the right enemies, and I agree with that. I mean, to the extent that his enemies are the New York Times, the CNN, the mainstream media, the Washington establishment, that's all fine and good. The problem is he had the right enemies, but he had the wrong policies. Every one of the key policies in the economic realm were wrong. Even in foreign policy, where I think he had the right slogans, he started to talk about America first. He started to talk about the obsolescence of NATO. All of those were good points. But when it came to actual policy, he did almost nothing to implement those changes in national security policy. And worse, he took a $600 billion defense budget that he inherited, which was already way too big, and pushed it up to $850 billion on the theory that if he had a bigger club, he could make the world behave according to his own lights. Well, all of this, tarnished the record completely. And I don't think, my motivation, you asked the motivation, is I profoundly believe he doesn't deserve a second chance, that the country needs a restoration of a real conservative government. If we can't get it in 24 because the right candidate isn't there, then, rebuild the brand, rebuild the party, go after it in 2028. But let's not Trumpify the Republican Party and turn it into this kind of grotesque, spending and easy money and interventionist, neocon-driven operation that it is today.
Okay, interesting. So we have a lot to talk about.
Yes, we do.
We're obviously going to get to immigration. We're going to get to national security, all of these, the COVID response, all of these sort of issues that you've just lighted on. But early in the book, you call Trump an all-around big government statist, which is seems like quite the statement. So I was wondering if you could unpack that for us a little bit. What do you mean by that phrase?
By a big government statist, I mean, he inherited a public debt that was way too big, $20 trillion. By the time he left, it was $28 trillion just in 4 years. That's a big number, I know, but put it in perspective and ask the question, how long did it take us to get the first $8 trillion of the public debt, the same number he generated during his term? The answer is 216 years. The first 43 presidents through 2005 created $8 trillion of debt. He did it in 4 years. The deficit averaged 9% of GDP during his 4 years, compared to an average of 2.5% among all presidents since, say, 1950. It was even dramatically bigger than Obama, who, of course, the Republicans spent 8 years criticizing for being a big spender and running up the national debt. But the reason I think he's a statist is that, when it comes to foreign trade, he basically decided, I'm going to levy a huge tariff on imports coming in from China. It averages, about 20% on 360 billion worth of imports. That's 75 billion or so a year of taxes on consumers. But it's actually a lot worse than that, because in the categories that bear the Trump tariffs, there's about 1.2 trillion of imports. China accounts for about 30%. So when you raise the landed price by 20% of everything coming out of China, in those categories, the competitors raise their prices as well. So, I compute it's something like $150 billion a year was, put on the economy, added to the inflationary pressure as a result of a protectionist trade policy that's about as statist as you can get. I think the same thing is true with his wall in Mexico. Yeah, we have a huge disorder at the border, but the issue isn't closed or open or building a wall. The issue is these people are coming here because they want jobs, they want a better life. Well, if we had an organized guest worker program in a country that is seriously suffering from a labor shortage and a native workforce that is actually shrinking, the right thing to do was not to build a wall. The right thing to do was to set up a guest worker program and welcome new workers into our economy. So you could go across a lot of issues, and they add up to the idea that the strong man sitting in the White House can make everything better by manipulating the fiscal, the monetary, the regulatory tools of the state to improve on economic and social life. That's statism, and that's basically what Republicans should be against. That's the job of the Democrats to advocate that, and Trump basically essentially did the same thing.
And we'll get back to a lot of those more specific policy points, but just sort of as we get into the beginning of the book, one thing that I thought was interesting, one way that you framed this book, was kind of talking about the economic track record under Trump and saying that he maybe shouldn't be getting as much credit as he is with voters for his economic record. I wonder if you could walk us through why you think that, where you think people's perceptions differ from reality when it comes to the economic track record under President Trump.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and it's the first chapter of my book. And the point was that a lot of conservative Republicans that I've talked to over the years say, yes, he was a terrible big spender. The debt soared on his watch. The lockdowns were not the smartest thing that we've ever done. But, and there's this big but we had a great economy. He claimed it was the best economy ever. And the answer is the so-called MAGA economy was not the greatest economy ever. And so I went through it in detail, every administration back to Truman. And if you lay it out, Trump had the worst record in terms of economic growth of any president, Republican or Democrat, going back to the early 1950s. The average economic growth during his 4 years was 1.5%. The average for all presidents up through 2016 was over 3%, so per year, of course. So we're talking about a growth rate that is half of the historic level. If you look at jobs, well, he didn't generate any jobs despite everything he says. There were 145.5 million jobs when he was sworn in January 2017. There were 142.5 million jobs when he left in 2021, reluctantly or otherwise. So there was a loss of 3 million non-farm payroll jobs during his 4 years. So that isn't, a great job creator either. And then, of course, people will say, oh, that's because of the COVID and the lockdowns in the spring of 2020. But, I go through that at length in the book as well, because I think it's important to raise what I call the Harry Truman standard. And that, of course, famously was the buck stops here. And the lockdowns and the economic chaos that resulted in the spring of 2020, including, a 30% drop in GDP at an annualized run rate, was not caused by the virus. It was caused by the lockdown. It was caused by the utter fear that was sown in the American public as a result of the White House task force day in and day out using the bully pulpit to scare the hell out of the public. And so, we got the economic collapse that was totally unnecessary. So you can't let him off the hook, but even if you do and say, well, the world stopped in February 2020, even then, the growth rate of jobs under Trump was about 1.4% per year, well less than the 2 to 2.5% norm that you can see in the record going back to most of the presidents since Eisenhower. So again, the point I'm trying to make is it wasn't a magnificent MAGA economy. And if you look at sort of the bottom line, which is what I would call the core metric that addresses living standards, and are we progressing or are we regressing, that's real GDP per capita. And Trump has the worst record of any president practically of modern times. The average growth of GDP per capita was about 2.3% per year going back all the way to the 50s. It was only 1% under Donald Trump. So therefore, you can't wash away, you can't erase all of the bad policy from an economic perspective that happened on his watch on the grounds that he made the economy hum. First of all, he didn't. And second, he left a very difficult legacy of debt, at the U.S. Treasury, and more importantly, a failure of the Fed to finally normalize interest rates as the economy got into the sweet spot of the business cycle recovery. By the 2016, we were in the sweet spot. The economy was moving on its own two legs, so to speak. It didn't need stimulus from Washington any longer, and particularly it didn't need zero interest rates. So the period 2016 to 2020 should have been a time for normalization of policy. The deficit should have been brought down to close to zero as the economy went into the middle and final stages of a long cycle recovery. And the Fed should have been encouraged to dramatically normalize interest rates, get out of the QE business, which it stayed in until well into 2018. But what happened on Trump's watch? He spent 4 years haranguing and harassing the Fed when it tried even sort of tepidly to get interest rates back off the zero bound and to get this balance sheet that had grown from $900 billion prior to the crisis to $4.5 trillion. That was supposed to shrink. Even Bernanke had promised that was going to happen. And as they tried to do that on Trump's watch, he came down on all fours, attacking the Fed practically every other week. And so we didn't get the normalization. What we got was a very weak Fed chairman who was appointed by Trump, who kept QE in place until March 2020, until March 2022. And as a result of that, we already had an inflationary whirlwind generating. You could see that in the numbers, and yet they continued to keep interest rates at practically zero, and they continued to buy 120 billion of bonds and other debt paper per month. So all of this was put in motion during the Trump regime, and we ended up with a really serious monetary mess on our hands today.
I want to come back to the Fed, but before we do that, I wanted to talk a little bit more about sort of the economic record that you were citing earlier.
Sure.
I think it's important to note for our viewers who might not be as familiar with the statistics that what we saw in the first couple of years of the Trump administration before the onset of the pandemic basically looked quite a bit like what we were seeing in the years before Trump took office. We were late in an economic cycle, jobs were growing in sort of that 150,000 to 200,000 per month range. Growth was in the sort of 1.8% annual range, pretty consistent with those last couple of years. And so I guess I wonder, A, do you think it's fair to criticize that as being slow growth at a time when it seemed kind of like what perhaps the economy was capable of? So that's question A. And then question B is, why do you think it's fair to include the coronavirus within that period? Because I think a lot of economists would say the coronavirus was such an exceptional, unusual circumstance that it really shouldn't be part of the economic record here.
Well, it happened. You got to separate the virus and the health issue from the lockdown and the disaster that hit the economy just out of the blue in March and April 2020. I've got one statistic in the book that I think is worth mentioning, and that is the place where most of the jobs had been created in the previous cycle recovery, for better or worse, was in the leisure and hospitality sector: restaurants, bars, hotels, etc., sports arenas. In 1 month of April 2020, the job, the index of hours, I use that, which I think is better than just the pure head count, but the index of hours worked dropped by 55% in 1 month. I mean, it basically, the whole sector, what we might call social venues got shut down, And the hours worked by the end of that month or early May had been rolled all the way back to 1979 levels in those industries. In other words, 43 years worth of growth in hours worked and head counts was wiped out in 30 days because of this whirlwind that hit the economy as a result of the orders that were coming out of Fauci and the president's task force. So I think you cannot let him off the hook. He should have known better if he had any principles whatsoever about markets and about how the role of government and had been willing to consult lots of experts on the outside who cautioned against it, day one. That never would have happened, and therefore you can't let him off the hook. But even if you do and stop the world, as I was saying, in February 2020, before any of these lockdown impacts happen, the growth rate of employment still was only 1.4% per year in the three years and couple months of his term, well below the average of the last 34 years. Or even if you take your point about the business cycle, I think it's fair to compare the Obama second term with Trump's first 3 years before the COVID. And if you look at the job creation rate, it was 215 per month during Obama's second term and 145 per month, 145,000 per month during Trump. So he was 30% short of what even Obama had generated. Now, I'm not saying that the economy should have been growing by leaps and bounds, because there are all kinds of reasons that I think growth has been sharply curtailed on a trend basis, that basically due to bad policy, too much money printing by the Fed, too much speculation, too much siphoning of capital into financial engineering rather than investment. There's lots of things we could go into, the massive public and private debt that's been created. But the point is, you shouldn't be bragging about the greatest economy ever when it wasn't remotely the case. It didn't happen. It's a myth. We had a very poorly performing economy that needed fundamental reform. It needed a Fed that was getting out of the bubble generation business. It needed a Congress that was going to attempt to balance the budget and get the Treasury out of the bond pits and out of the financial markets. It needed more workers to meet growth requirements, because the native-born workforce is shrinking, as I said. Well, Trump stood in the way of all those. He wanted easier money. He wanted more spending. He wanted bigger debts. He wanted more Treasury borrowing. He wanted to close down the border, both in terms of people who might have come here to work and goods that wanted to come in here as a result of trade. So, in other words, you had a very poorly performing economy overlaid with policies that only made it worse.
Interesting. And, one thing that you talk about quite a bit in the book, and which you just alluded to, is this idea that the coronavirus shutdown shouldn't have happened, that they somehow went against principles that Trump should have adhered to. I guess I wonder if you could lay out for viewers what you think should have happened instead. Why do you think the lockdown shouldn't have occurred, and what should have been the alternative?
Well, first of all, it shouldn't have occurred because it was basically a one-size-fits-all across the board. Everybody, was sent home from school, sent home from work, sent home from the shopping center, sent home from the restaurants, etc., when it was clear from the very beginning that, the coronavirus was a serious health challenge, but it wasn't anything like the Black Plague or some kind of lethal virus that was going to take people down left and right. And I have some books, I have some facts, I should say, in my book that I think dramatizes this. If you look at the so-called with COVID death rates in 2020, before we had the vaccines and whatever impact that had, we can set that aside. But if you look at 2020 and you look at the population, I looked at it in 6 categories with what I call the school age population under 16, and then I had the young people, and then I had the core working age population, near retirees, grandparents, and great-grandparents. I mention all this because if you go from top to bottom, the fatality rate for the school age population was 0.2 per 100,000. For the working age population, 30 to 55 or so, it was 20 per 100,000. For the great-grandparents population, it was 2,000 per 100,000. In other words, the risk of death was 10,000 times higher among the great-grandparents population or generation as young people, and then there was a curve all the way in between. Well, that is the very opposite of something suggesting across the board lockdowns, shutdowns, and basically a termination of social activity. So it should have been focused entirely, as the great Barrington authors and statements said very early after that, the fall of 2020, on the most vulnerable populations who were compromised because of age or because of comorbidity, and the statistics speak for themselves. Now, you can say, well, maybe they didn't know that in March and April of 2020, and you got to give them a pass. Well, the answer is they had dramatic evidence even before Trump made his March 16th, call to shut down the economy and declared an emergency. And that was, this ship that had been floating around the Princess cruise ship. And there were something like 3,600 people on that, staff and guests. It very heavily skewed to the elderly because that's who goes on cruises, the Diamond Princess ship. And yet the facts were known in March that the fatality rate for the population of that ship that was close quarters, and they'd been tested many times and they just couldn't land at any port, no one would take them. The fatality rate for people under 70 was not zero, or the survival rate was 100%. And even for the elderly population in that group, there were 7 deaths in the total population, and so a 99.5% survival rate. So if you knew those facts, and they should have known those facts, here was like a live real-time demonstration that this is a illness you don't particularly want to get, but it is not a black plague that requires us to throw away the Constitution, to throw away our playbook in terms of how you run a healthy free enterprise economy, how you allow personal liberty. There was no basis for that extreme lurch into basically totalitarian economics, and Trump presided over it. He authorized it. He went along with it for months and months and months, and you just can't let him off the hook. That's probably one of the worst things that any president has done in modern times, in my view. And it's in itself, those lockdowns, that whole COVID disaster is, an indictment for which there is no escape.
It seems important to note that even with the lockdowns, excess mortality from COVID was something like 620,000 in 2020 and 540,000 in 2021 per the National Institutes for Health. And that is, dramatic. For context, the flu is something like 37 to 70,000 a year. So pretty significant excess mortality even with the lockdown, which I guess begs the question, is there any level of pandemic that you would have seen a lockdown being appropriate for? Like is that kind of public health response ever appropriate, or are you just against that kind of response on principle?
Well, I think if you had a true Black Plague where you had a fatality, because the excess fatality rates that you've cited there, I guess they're, obviously they're correct numbers, but again, that wasn't a Black Plague. If you look at the all-in death rates for all causes in the United States, the death rate in 2020 was actually lower. Now, this is 2020 in the worst of the COVID, okay, and before you had vaccine and before we started to come out of the foxholes. The death rate in 2020 for the population as a whole was lower than it had been in 2003. Okay, and as I can remember 2003, it wasn't like some nightmare disaster where people were dropping like flies. It was even lower than it had been in 1991, which again wasn't essentially a bad time in America. So therefore, it wasn't even in the ballpark that would require some kind of all-in government quasi-totalitarian response. I can imagine something bad enough that might eventually warrant that, but we're talking about facts here, and the facts aren't even close. If you're going to shut down the economy because there is an excess death rate that is, relatively modest compared to the normal trend, and if it's based on a change in the way they categorize death certificates, because this is all based on deaths with COVID, not because of COVID. Anybody that had a positive test before in the hospital or after they departed this world who tested positive became another COVID death certificate statistic, and I think that's very dubious. So again, if you really dig into this, there is just no case for this kind of sweeping response, and it's on Trump's watch.
I feel like we could continue talking about the coronavirus lockdown all day, but we only have 27 minutes left, so I want to move on to another topic, which is, you talked about the Fed a little bit earlier. Federal Reserve is near and dear to my heart. This is the topic I cover every day. And so I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier, which was that Donald Trump, was up in the bully pulpit pressuring the Fed to keep interest rates low and to sort of keep the money printer whirring, even ahead of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, as someone who covers the Fed, the institution is granted independence from the White House. Trump can't tell them what to do. In fact, Trump looked into whether he could fire Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, over the fact that Powell wasn't doing what he wanted him to do, and discovered that he couldn't. He didn't have the statutory authority to do that. And so I guess I wonder if you could kind of square that for me. To what extent was Trump actually being successful at pressuring the Fed in your mind, and based on what evidence?
We'll never know what factors were going through the minds of the 12 members of the FOMC when month after month they basically blinked when it was damn obvious that they should have been getting interest rates back into some normal area. But, I don't believe in the Fed very much, okay? I think it's expanded its remit way beyond anything that is necessary or rational. They're basically trying to fine-tune and micromanage a $26 trillion economy that's totally enmeshed in $104 trillion world GDP. They can't possibly do it. Their tools are too rubbery and weak and ineffective. They shouldn't be trying to do all of the macro management that they do. So I I'm a total skeptic. I'm anti-Fed, as anti-Fed as they come, and that colors my view of this. But the idea that a Republican president would say, and listen, we have to look at the statistics. This is in 2017, 2018, when they were trying to begin to raise rates. We had gone through a period of 8 years from the spring of 2008 until Trump became president. That's 108 months, in which the federal funds rate, when you subtract inflation, and I use the 16% trim mean CPI, but you can use the other ones if you want, was negative in real terms. In other words, 8 years of negative real interest rates in the money market, 8 years where you had interest rates almost down on the floorboard, the zero bound. And that was, totally inappropriate, I think. And a Republican president who inherited that, and notwithstanding all the niceties about the independence of the Fed, which I think is grossly exaggerated anyway, but anyway, notwithstanding that, he should have been quietly or publicly telling the Fed the crisis is over, the emergency ended long ago, it's time to do what Bernanke said he was going to do in 2011, in 2012, and that is normalize the balance sheet, that is get into QT big time and get rates back up above, the flat line in terms of real rates, that is, after inflation. Because if you don't do that, you're just going to fuel massive speculation, and that's what they did. And then Trump took credit for a huge bubble in the stock market that was nothing, had nothing to do with what he accomplished. It was just a result of this massive flood of Federal Reserve credit. So I think, you have to look at the point in time in which things happen. There are obviously some fundamental principles or truism about policy, but the business cycle is important. And when you got into 2017, you were in the sweet spot. You were in the middle, if not the back end of what had been a weak but long-lasting recovery from the Great Recession. And so it was time that Republicans, conventional, conservative Republicans would have been saying normalize the fiscal posture, normalize interest rates in the Fed position, get it out of this massive 120 billion per month bond buying insanity. But of course Trump came from the other side. I mean, William Jennings Bryan probably would have turned blue with envy in terms of what Trump was actually doing in monetary policy. In fact, you just have to state it. On monetary policy, Donald Trump is a complete crackpot. He has no idea what he's talking about. And I have a little thing in the book where I point out the only reason he allegedly got rich is that he was a big speculator in New York real estate. Condo prices went up 250% from the late 90s to when he became president. Interest rates, the carry cost, all the debt that financed it, went from 4% to 1%. So what's not to like about a world in which asset prices are soaring and the cost of carry is being driven to the floorboard? Well, that isn't sustainable, obviously, but Trump learned from that the lower the interest rate, the better, and the more money they print, allegedly, the wealthier will become. It was totally a wrong, bad life lesson, and yet that's the baggage he comes with.
And we should note for context for our viewers who maybe aren't as familiar, don't have these graphs memorized, the Fed had been raising interest rates from the end of 2015 up through 2018, but very slowly. They lowered them a couple of times in 2019 and then cut them pretty dramatically at the start of 2020. Likewise, they had stopped their quantitative easing, that policy of buying bonds, and it actually started to reverse the process, but it stopped that. And then there were some market disruptions in 2019 that prompted them to start buying bonds at a sort of slow pace again. And then starting in early 2020, they began buying bonds at a very, very rapid pace. And so the reason I do all of that introduction is that this factors really heavily into the next portion of your book, which is where you talk about sort of the response to CARES, both the Fed response, this big bond buying and very low interest rates, and the fiscal policy response, the Congress passed government spending packages, and how they interacted. And I wonder if you could tell our viewers a little bit about how sort of you characterize those, what you think the consequences were.
Yeah, first of all, we're dealing with such huge numbers that you have to put a little perspective on it, and I guess I've had some history or experience over the years when it comes to big budget numbers. But the original CARES Act, 2.2 trillion, was actually tabled, written, and passed in 11 days, okay? Now, how do you pass a 2.2 trillion spending bill, some 800 pages, that had everything except the kitchen sink included in terms of money going to every sector and every constituency you can imagine? How do you do that in 11 days when that amounts to what at that time would have been 45% of the existing in-place budget? In other words, in 11 days, they pumped more money into the spending stream than 45% as much money into the spending stream as the whole budget, from defense to Social Security to interest to student aid and all the rest of it. It was crazy. It was insane. A conservative president would have had the veto pen out and had it in red ink ready to veto. And Trump urged it on. In fact, a couple days after he said we're shutting down the economy, he said, but don't worry, money's on the way, help is on the way. We're going to just, flood you with relief. Well, that's part of the whole mess that we're dealing with. And then the Fed made it all possible, so the congressman who passed this bill on a bipartisan basis should have gotten a pretty bad feedback from the bond market saying, hey, if you're going to pump the deficit at this late stage of the business cycle at this kind of rate, interest rates are going to go up and go up substantially. And so the Fed stepped in and basically monetized most of the new debt that was being created overnight by this first bill. And then, of course, the CARES Act was just a warm-up. In December, they put another $2 trillion on, and shortly thereafter, Biden added his $2 trillion, most of which was just a continuation of like the $600 a week unemployment topper that Trump had backed and signed into law twice, another round of stimulus checks, which he had actually advocated, $2,000 per person during the campaign when he was running for re-election. So, I say he's as responsible for that last $2 trillion as anybody else. Well, it added up to $6.5 trillion in 12 months. I mean, this is crazy. It was 150% of the normal federal budget was added on in 365 days, and most of it was either signed by Trump or were measures, a continuation of measures that he had strongly backed. And so that would have caused chaos in the financial system had the Fed not stepped in and monetized the whole thing. And of course, it was only a matter of time then before we were off to the races with, the highest inflation since the 1970s, the highest inflation in 40 years. And it didn't come by immaculate conception. It didn't come out of the global oil market or anything else. It was basically manufactured by central banks led by the Fed and governments led by Washington, spending like there was no tomorrow.
And I want to circle back to the inflation in just a moment, but before we do that, I wanted to talk just a beat further about the CARES Act, that first package that passed in early 2020. As you noted, President Trump signed it into law. He had pushed for it, but Congress passed it with pretty broad, I think complete bipartisan support, if memory serves. And so I guess I wonder, is it fair to lay the blame for that package at President Trump's feet when it was something, obviously, that Congress wanted as well?
Oh, it's totally fair to blame him. The bully pulpit is in the Oval Office. He should have said, absolutely no way, no how. If you send a bill that's even remotely this indiscriminate, there were no standards, there were no monitoring mechanisms. They were just passing out pork like Washington had never done before. He should have said, I dare you to send it down here because it's going to get the veto, and I dare you to try to override it because I'm going to go to the American public. We're not going to, engage in this kind of absolute, abject fiscal profligacy. So that's the first point. He is totally to blame for the fact that they got a head of steam up on Capitol Hill, and it was the biggest, pork barrel, trading operation that we've ever seen, and truly that we've ever seen in peacetime or wartime. And then the one guy who had the common sense, the integrity, and the courage to say, no way, we're not going to pass this on a voice vote, because they wanted to pass it on a voice vote, was Tom Massey, Congressman Massey from Kentucky. And what did Donald Trump say? He denounced him viciously and demanded that he be run out of the Republican Party. So is Donald Trump responsible at the end of the day for this CARES disaster and then the $4 trillion that got laid on top of that? Absolutely.
And returning back to the inflation point that you were making earlier, so, obviously we did see in the wake of the pandemic starting in early 2021, a real takeoff in inflation. The consumer price index, which is sort of the most commonly used measure of inflation, peaked at 9.1% on a year-over-year basis in mid-2022. It's now down to something like 3%. I guess I wonder, can you walk us through what you think drove that inflation? And then I wonder, you talk quite a bit about sort of this stagflation idea in the book, but I wonder if you can kind of square that with the fact that inflation has now faded quite a bit.
Well, I would say it's not faded as much as the headline number would tell you. As I said, I look at something that's more of a core. I think the 16% trim mean CPI is a good measure. That was running 2 to 3% even before COVID, even before February 2020. So even if you believed in 2% inflation targeting, which I don't, it should be zero. That's what price stability means. But even if you believe in
we should note for viewers that 2% is the Fed's inflation target.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
They aim for 2% annual inflation.
Right. But even if you believe in it, we were already running ahead of it, and it eventually peaked in September on the proper measure. In other words, as you know, the 16% trim mean very quickly takes out the lowest 8% of price changes and the highest 8% each month. It's a different item each month of the thousands in the BLS basket. And so therefore it gives you the trend without some of the short-run monthly volatility that comes when there's a big spike in, say, energy prices up or down, or food or other commodities. In any event, it peaked at 7% in September 2022. It's now running at 4%. So it's come down, I agree, but it's still double the trend rate, the run rate, where it was before all of this COVID stimulus and money printing took off. Now, did this cause the inflation? Of course it did. It doesn't happen by immaculate conception, and it happened because you put all that stimulus money into the economy. And I think another statistic I have in the book is well worth mentioning, and that is, every month statistical authorities publish data on transfer payments from government. That's a very good statistic to look at, but the normal run rate of all transfer payments, and this is food stamps and welfare and housing and also social insurance and Medicare, Medicaid, the rest of it, was running about 3.1 trillion at an annual rate right before March 2020. After the first bill was enacted, the run rate of transfer payments was 6 trillion per annum. And by the time the second COVID or third COVID bill, the Biden final installment, got enacted, the run rate of transfer payments that were flooding into the economy and being spent was 8 trillion. Now, I can't emphasize that enough. When you go from a system that is basically being watered, watered with transfer money to spend at a 3 trillion rate, and suddenly a year later it's running at 8 trillion at an annual rate, you are shocking the economy with spending, a spending impulse almost overnight, unlike anything we've ever seen in historic cycles. So that's where the inflation came from, because further, most of the money that was being spent incrementally from the stimulus checks or the $600 per month toppers or just the regular paychecks that most of the public was still earning couldn't be spent for the most part in social venues, restaurants, bars, etc. They were all shut down. So people went hand over fist into buying merchandise good, durable goods. And of course, all of those were sourced abroad. And so suddenly the supply chains break down, the inventory in the pipeline system within the country was totally depleted. And you got a huge surge in prices for durable goods that had been going down year after year after year for the last couple of decades. So that's where the whole thing started, and then it simply propagated through the system. But none of it would have happened without the shutdowns. None of it would have happened without the massive, unreviewed stimulus bills. None of it would have happened if the Fed hadn't monetized all that debt. In other words, there were 3 checkpoints along the way. You could have said, we've got a pretty serious seasonal virus on our hands, and we're going to do everything we can to protect the elderly and other vulnerable populations, but it wouldn't have taken much extra spending. Believe me, they could have done that. Or second, they could have said, we're not going to bail out the economy if just because we're shutting down things temporarily. And third, they could have said, we're not printing the money in order to fund these out of control bailouts. So that nexus, those 3 factors, and then if you lay on top of that, by then, the Trump tariffs were beginning to bite, and so again, I said it was a $75 billion a year upcharge just on the covered Chinese goods, but I think it was more like $150 billion if you take all the other imports in those categories that were under the price umbrella of the Trump tariff. And then if you add on top of that the drying up of new workers coming through the immigration route, you had a perfect storm. Not enough workers, not enough product, spending like never before, in money printing that was really beyond imagination. Remember, you mentioned that in the fall of 2019, when we had the little hiccup in the bond market, in the repo market, they restarted QE, but at that point they had gotten the balance sheet down to 3.8 trillion of the Fed from the mid-40s, and they went from 3.8 trillion in September 2019 to 9 trillion within the next 2 or 3 months. I mean, this is out of this world. Nothing like this has ever been done before. And if people are surprised that, one, we had this burst of inflation, they shouldn't be. And second, if they think it's all over because the headline rate is down to 3, for a month or two, I think, they're deluded. We have, injected into the economy some massive inflationary pressure that's going to take years to eventually work out of the system.
Okay, interesting. And, I think we are just about out of time, but I wonder, before we wrap, you talk quite a bit in the book about immigration, and I'm sorry that we didn't manage to get to that topic in more detail, but I wonder if you could just sort of lay out your arguments. I know it's something C-SPAN viewers are really interested in, so I wonder if you could just lay out your arguments and maybe sort of conclude with some final thoughts.
Well, I think you have to reject the demagoguery that started when Trump came down the escalator in Trump Tower and start talking about the rapists and murderers and other bad people coming across the border. That is totally a wrong characterization. Overwhelmingly, 95% of the people coming to the border are coming for jobs and for a better life. They're not criminals. They're not drug dealers. They're not foreign terrorists. This is just a lot of baloney. And our economy was built on welcoming immigrant populations. That's how we became the leading industrial power of the world, obviously, from 1870 to post-World War II. And we need to understand that what is needed, the reason they're all illegal is we have a stupid law that says if you want to come to the United States, you have to either get a family-based slot in the quota system, or you have to become a refugee or seek asylum. Well, that's, of course, it creates a mess. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. Well, let's not say they're asylum seekers, the people coming from Central America or Mexico. They're job seekers. Have a job program. Have a guest worker program. Give them a permit to work. Let them go to Kansas City or Detroit or, Wilmington, Delaware, wherever there are jobs. And as long as they're earning a paycheck, they should be entitled to stay here, not be deported, not be harassed, not be chased down by the hobnail boots of the whole immigration control apparatus. And if they are good citizens and pay taxes for a half decade or decade, they should be eligible for citizenship, no questions asked. That's how the whole, great miracle of the American economy was built over the 100 years prior to 1980.
And I think that is all we have time for. Okay. So thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. David Stockman, author of Trump's War on Capitalism, and here talking with Jeanna Smialek from the New York Times. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.